The grand hall of Ashwood Manor fell into complete silence the moment little Theodore spoke. Every servant, every guest, every member of the household stood frozen like statues. The Duke himself dropped his wine glass, and it shattered against the marble floor, but nobody moved to clean it. All eyes turned to the small boy with golden curls who stood at the top of the staircase, holding the hand of a young woman in a plain gray dress. Theodore was 3 years old, and he had never spoken a single word in his entire life. The doctors had examined him countless times. They said his tongue was fine, and his hearing was perfect, but the words simply would not come. The Duke had spent fortunes bringing specialists from across the continent. Priests had prayed over the child. Healers had given him strange medicines. Nothing worked. The boy remained silent as a stone, while his father grew more desperate with each passing month. The silence had become a curse that haunted Ashwood Manor. It reminded everyone of the tragedy that had struck 2 years ago when the Duchess died, giving birth to her second child. The baby had not survived either. Since that dark day, the Duke had become a shadow of himself, and his son had retreated into a world without sound or speech. The servants whispered that the boy was broken by grief just like his father. Some said he would never speak at all. Then Clara arrived 3 weeks ago, and everything began to change in ways nobody could have predicted. Clara Bennett was not supposed to be the governess. She was 22 years old with no experience and no references from noble families. She had grown up in a small village, helping her mother run a bakery. She knew how to knead bread and sing folk songs, but she knew nothing about raising a duke's heir. The position had been meant for an older woman from London, with impressive credentials, but that woman had fallen ill the day before her journey. The agency had sent Clara as a temporary replacement and promised someone better would come soon. The Duke had barely looked at Clara when she arrived. He had simply nodded and told the head butler to show her to the nursery. Clara had climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor with her small bag and her beating heart. She had no idea what to expect, but she needed this position desperately. Her mother was sick, and the medical bills were crushing their family. This job paid more in a month than she could earn in a year at the bakery. Or when Clara first entered the nursery, she found Theodore sitting alone by the window. He was staring out at the gardens with empty eyes. He did not turn when she walked in. He did not acknowledge her presence at all. The previous governess had left detailed notes explaining that the boy did not respond to anything. He would not play with toys or eat unless forced. He spent his days in silence, staring at nothing. Clara had felt her heart break looking at this small, lonely child. She did not see a duke's heir. She saw a little boy who had lost his mother and did not know how to find his way back to the world. She sat down on the floor beside him without saying a word. She did not try to make him talk or play. She simply sat with him in his silence. Hours passed like that on the first day. Clara sat beside Theodore while he stared out the window. She hummed softly sometimes, but mostly she just existed in his space without demanding anything from him. When evening came, she helped him eat dinner by making it into a gentle game. She did not force him. She did not scold him. She just made eating feel safe and easy. The next day she came back and sat with him again. This time she brought a book of fairy tales. She did not ask Theodore to look at the pictures. She just read aloud in a soft voice while he stared at the gardens. She read about brave knights and kind princesses and magical forests. Sometimes she felt silly reading to a child who showed no sign of listening, but she kept going anyway. On the 3rd day, something small happened. Theodore glanced at her for just a second when she entered the room. It was so quick that Clara almost missed it, but her heart leaped with hope. She sat down in her usual spot and began to read. Halfway through the story about a lost prince, she felt a tiny hand touch her sleeve. She looked down and found Theodore had moved closer to her. He was not looking at her face, but he was there beside her, touching her sleeve like he needed to know she was real. Clara did not make a big reaction. She just kept reading and let him stay close. From that day forward, Theodore began to follow her everywhere. He shadowed her steps through the nursery. When she sang while tidying up, he would stand nearby and listen. When she sat in the rocking chair, he would climb into her lap without a word. The servants began to notice the change. The boy who had been unreachable was clinging to this simple village girl like she was his lifeline. The Duke noticed too, but he said nothing. He would sometimes stand in the doorway of the nursery and watch Clara with his son. He saw how gentle she was and how patient. He saw how Theodore had started eating properly and sleeping through the night. The darkness in his own heart made him suspicious of Joy, but he could not deny that something was happening. His son was coming back to life. Then came the day of the charity banquet. The Duke was required to host it every year to maintain his social standing. The house filled with nobles and important families from the surrounding counties. Clara had been told to keep Theodore in the nursery during the event, but the boy had been restless all afternoon. He kept pulling at her hand and leading her toward the door. Finally, Clara decided a short walk through the upper hallway might calm him down. They were standing at the top of the grand staircase, looking down at the glittering crowd when it happened. Theodore saw his father standing in the center of the hall, surrounded by important men. The Duke looked up, and his eyes met his son's. For a moment, father and son just stared at each other across the distance. Then, Theodore squeezed Clara's hand tight. His little face was serious and determined. He opened his mouth, and the word came out clear as a bell ringing through the silent manor. "Mama!" He was pointing at Clara and calling her Mama in front of everyone who mattered in the Duke's world. The word hung in the air like a spell that nobody knew how to break. Clara felt her entire body go cold and then hot with panic. Her hand trembled in Theodore's small grip. She wanted to correct him immediately, but her voice would not come. She looked down at the crowd and saw dozens of faces staring up at her, with shock and confusion and judgment written across them. The Duke stood completely still. His face had gone pale as winter snow. His dark eyes were locked on his son, with an expression Clara could not read. Was it anger, or pain, or something else entirely? She could not tell, and the not knowing terrified her. She had crossed a line she did not even know existed. This child had called her Mama, and now everything was ruined. A woman in an expensive purple gown leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind her fan. The whisper spread through the crowd like wildfire. Within seconds, the entire hall was buzzing with hushed conversations. Clara heard fragments of words floating up to her. Scandal. Inappropriate. Who does she think she is? The disapproval was thick enough to choke on. Clara's first instinct was to run. She wanted to grab her bag and flee from Ashwood Manor before the Duke could dismiss her in front of all these people. But Theodore was still holding her hand and looking up at her with such trust and love that she could not move. This little boy had finally spoken after years of silence, and his first word had been for her. How could she abandon him now, even to save herself from humiliation? The Duke began walking toward the staircase. Each step echoed through the silent hall. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had no defense for what had happened. She had not taught Theodore to call her that. She had never tried to replace his dead mother. But who would believe her? She was just a poor village girl with no connections and no proof of her innocence. When the Duke reached the bottom of the stairs, he paused and looked up at them. His jaw was tight and his hands were clenched at his sides. Clara prepared herself for the worst. She imagined him ordering her to leave immediately. She imagined him accusing her of manipulating his son for her own gain. She imagined losing everything, including this child who had somehow claimed a piece of her heart. But the Duke did not yell. Instead, he climbed the stairs slowly until he stood directly in front of them. He knelt down so he was eye level with Theodore. His voice when he spoke was rough with emotion he could barely contain. "Theodore, say it again, son. Please." Theodore looked at his father for a long moment. Then he looked back at Clara. He seemed confused about what was being asked of him. Clara's throat was tight with tears she could not shed. She gently touched Theodore's shoulder and spoke softly. "It's all right, sweetheart. Your papa wants to hear your voice." Theodore considered this. Then he pointed at Clara again and repeated the word with absolute certainty. "Mama." The Duke closed his eyes, and Clara saw a tear slip down his cheek. When he opened his eyes again, he was looking at Clara with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was no anger in his gaze. Instead, there was something raw and vulnerable and desperately sad. "He has not spoken in 3 years, the Duke said quietly. "The doctor said he might never speak at all, but you made him feel safe enough to try." Clara did not know what to say. The crowd below had gone completely silent again, listening to every word. She felt exposed standing there with everyone watching, but she could not look away from the Duke's face. "I am sorry, Your Grace," Clara whispered. "I never meant for him to become confused. I never tried to take her place." The Duke shook his head slowly. He reached out and placed a hand on his son's head, with such gentleness that Clara's heart ached watching it. "My wife was a wonderful woman," he said, "but Theodore barely remembers her. He was only 1 year old when she died. You are not replacing anyone. You are giving him something he has never had before, a mother's love." The Duke stood up and turned to face the crowd below. His voice rang out strong and commanding. "Nah, my son has spoken his first words tonight. This is a blessing we should celebrate, not gossip about. Miss Bennet has accomplished what no doctor or specialist could do. She has brought my boy back to us. Anyone who wishes to criticize her can leave my house now." Nobody moved. The nobles looked at each other uncertainly. A few women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The man who had been standing beside the Duke earlier began to clap slowly. Others joined in until the entire hall was filled with applause. It was not the scandalized reaction Clara had expected. It was something closer to approval. The Duke turned back to Clara. "Will you come down and join the banquet, Miss Bennet? You and Theodore both. I think it is time my son was introduced properly to society." Clara wanted to refuse. She was wearing a plain gray dress, and her hair was simply pinned. She did not belong among these wealthy people with their jewels and fine clothes. But Theodore was pulling on her hand and looking at her with hopeful eyes. She could not say no to him. They descended the stairs together with Theodore between them. The Duke kept one hand on his son's shoulder, and Clara kept hold of Theodore's hand. When they reached the bottom, the crowd parted to let them through. Women smiled at Clara, though their smiles were complicated things, mixing curiosity with judgment. Men nodded respectfully to the Duke and ignored Clara entirely, as if she was invisible. The Duke led them to a table where refreshments were laid out. He handed Theodore a small cake, and the boy took it eagerly. Clara stood awkwardly beside them, not sure what her role was supposed to be. She was the governess, but she was also the woman this child had called Mama in front of everyone. The lines had blurred beyond recognition. An older woman in black lace approached them. She had kind eyes and silver hair piled high on her head. She looked at Clara with genuine warmth. "My dear, you must tell me your secret," she said. "I have a grandson who barely speaks, and his parents are at their wits' end. What did you do to help young Theodore find his voice?" Clara fumbled for an answer. "I just spent time with him. I read to him and sat with him. I did not force anything. I just let him know he was safe." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "Love and patience, then, the oldest remedies of all." Other women began to gather around asking questions. They wanted to know about Clara's methods and her background. Some were genuinely interested in helping their own children. Others were simply looking for more gossip to spread. Clara answered as best she could, while keeping one eye on Theodore, who was eating cake and watching the crowd with wide, curious eyes. The Duke stood nearby, accepting congratulations from various nobles. But Clara noticed he kept glancing back at her and his son. There was something protective in the way he positioned himself, like he was standing guard against anyone who might say something cruel. As the evening wore on, Theodore began to yawn. Clara knew it was past his bedtime. She caught the Duke's attention and gestured toward the stairs. He nodded and excused himself from his conversation. Together, they escorted Theodore back up to the nursery. But when they reached the room, Theodore climbed into his bed without protest. Clara tucked the blankets around him and smoothed his golden curls back from his forehead. The Duke stood in the doorway, watching them with an unreadable expression. "Good night, sweetheart," Clara whispered. Theodore grabbed her hand before she could pull away. He looked at her with sleepy eyes and said the word again. "Mama." Then he looked at his father and said a second word that made the Duke's breath catch. "Papa." The Duke crossed the room in 3 long strides. He knelt beside the bed and gathered his son into his arms. Theodore hugged him back, and Clara saw tears streaming down the Duke's face. He was crying openly now without shame. His son was talking. His son was calling him Papa. The grief that had held this house captive for 2 years was finally beginning to break apart. Clara stepped back to give them privacy. She moved toward the door quietly, not wanting to intrude on this moment between father and son. But the Duke's voice stopped her. "Stay. Please, Miss Bennet. Stay." Clara stayed by the doorway while the Duke held his son close. She watched as Theodore's eyes grew heavy and finally closed. The little boy fell asleep in his father's arms with a peaceful smile on his face. It was the first time Clara had seen him look so completely content. The Duke sat there for a long time, just holding him and stroking his hair. When he finally laid Theodore back down on the bed, his hands were gentle and sure. He pulled the blankets up to the boy's chin and kissed his forehead. Then he stood and walked toward Clara. She expected him to thank her and dismiss her for the night. Instead, he gestured for her to follow him into the hallway. He closed the nursery door quietly behind them, and they stood in the dimly lit corridor facing each other. "Miss Bennet, I need to speak with you about something important," the Duke said. His voice was low and serious. "Please walk with me." Clara nodded and fell into step beside him. They walked through the silent hallways of the manor until they reached a small sitting room she had never entered before. The Duke lit a lamp, and the warm light filled the space. The room was cozy with books lining the walls and comfortable chairs arranged near a fireplace. It felt personal in a way the rest of the grand house did not. "This was my wife's favorite room," the Duke said, as if reading Clara's thoughts. "She liked to come here to read and think. I have not been able to enter it since she died. But tonight feels different. Tonight feels like maybe the darkness is finally lifting." He gestured for Clara to sit, and she lowered herself into one of the chairs. The Duke remained standing and began to pace. He seemed to be struggling with what to say next. Clara waited quietly with her hands folded in her lap and her heart beating fast. "When my wife died, I thought my life was over," he finally said. I had lost the woman I loved and our newborn daughter in one terrible night. Theodore stopped speaking, and I did not know how to reach him. I was drowning in grief, and I could not save my own son from drowning with me. I hired governesses and tutors and doctors, but nothing helped. I started to believe that we were both broken beyond repair. He stopped pacing and looked directly at Clara. His dark eyes were full of emotion. Then you came. A simple village girl with no training and no experience. I thought you would fail, like all the others. I barely noticed you at first. But Theodore noticed you. He saw something in you that called to him. And slowly, day by day, you brought him back to life. You did not do it with fancy methods or expensive treatments. You did it with kindness and patience and love. Clara felt tears prickling at her eyes. She had not realized the Duke had been paying such close attention. She had thought he barely knew she existed. Tonight, when Theodore called you Mama, I felt a dozen different things at once, the Duke continued. Shock, yes, but also relief. Because I realized that my son finally has what he needs. He has someone who makes him feel safe and loved. Someone who sees him as a child and not as a duty or a problem to solve. The Duke crossed the room and knelt down in front of Clara's chair, just as he had knelt before his son. The gesture was so unexpected that Clara gasped. A duke did not kneel before a governess. It went against every rule of society. I know this is sudden and strange, he said. I know we barely know each other. But I need to ask you something. Will you stay with us? Not as a temporary governess, but as a permanent part of this family. Theodore needs you. And I think perhaps I need you too. Clara's mind was spinning. She did not understand what he was asking. Did he want her to be the official governess? Did he want to adopt her as some kind of companion? Oh, the words were not making sense. The Duke seemed to see her confusion. He took a deep breath and spoke more clearly. I am asking you to marry me, Clara Bennett. I am asking you to become Theodore's mother in truth and to become my wife. I know this seems impossible. You are a baker's daughter, and I am a duke. Society will have opinions about this. But I do not care any more what society thinks. My son spoke tonight because of you. He called you Mama because that is what you are to him. And I would be honored if you would make that real. Clara could not breathe. This could not be happening. Dukes did not propose to village girls. This was the stuff of fairy tales, not real life. But the Duke was looking at her with complete sincerity. He was waiting for her answer. Your Grace, I do not know what to say, Clara whispered. I care for Theodore deeply. He has become precious to me. But marriage, I never imagined. I am not educated in the ways of nobility. I would not know how to be a duchess. I am not asking you to be a perfect duchess, the Duke said gently. I am asking you to be yourself. The woman who sits on the floor and reads fairy tales. The woman who shows patience when everyone else has given up. The woman my son loves enough to break his silence for. That is who I need. That is who we both need. Clara looked into his eyes and saw the truth there. He was not playing games or making false promises. He was a man who had lost everything and found hope again through her connection with his son. He was offering her a life she had never dreamed possible, a life where she could give Theodore all the love he deserved, a life where she would never have to worry about money for her mother's medicine, a life that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. If I say yes, everything will change, Clara said softly, for both of us. Are you certain this is what you want? The Duke reached out and took her hand in his. His touch was warm and steady. I have never been more certain of anything. Say yes, Clara. Say yes, and let us build something new from the ruins of what was lost. Say yes, and help me raise my son. Say yes, and perhaps with time, we might even find love growing between us. I cannot promise it will be easy, but I can promise you will never face the difficulties alone." Clara thought of Theodore sleeping peacefully in his bed. She thought of the way he looked at her with complete trust. She thought of her mother, back in the village, who needed care. She thought of the Duke standing before her, offering her not just security, but partnership and respect. She thought of all the fairy tales she had read about impossible things coming true. She took a deep breath and made her choice. "Yes, I will marry you." The Duke's face transformed with relief and joy. He stood and pulled Clara to her feet. Then he did something that surprised her even more. He wrapped his arms around her and held her close. It was not a romantic embrace exactly. It was something deeper. It was two broken people finding shelter in each other. It was a promise being made without words. 3 months later, Clara stood in the chapel at Ashwood Manor, wearing a dress of ivory silk. Her mother sat in the front row crying happy tears. She had recovered well with the help of the best doctors the Duke's money could buy. Theodore stood beside his father at the altar, wearing a little suit and holding a ring on a velvet cushion. When Clara walked down the aisle, the boy grinned at her and whispered the word that had changed everything. "Mama." The Duke smiled at Clara as she reached his side. In the month since their engagement, they had spent many evenings talking and getting to know each other. Affection had grown between them slowly and naturally. It was not the passionate love of fairy tales, but it was real and warm and full of promise. When the priest asked if she would take this man as her husband, Clara answered clearly, "I will." Theodore cheered, and the small gathering of guests laughed warmly. The Duke kissed Clara's hand, and then lifted his son into his arms, so all 3 of them were together. They were no longer broken pieces struggling alone. They were a family knitted together by an unexpected blessing. They were proof that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the most surprising places. As they walked back down the aisle together, Clara looked at her new husband and her new son and felt her heart swell with gratitude. She had come to Ashwood Manor as a temporary replacement, with nothing but hope and kindness to offer. She was leaving the chapel as a duchess and a mother, with a future full of love stretching out before her. Theodore squeezed her hand and looked up at her with his bright eyes. "Love you, Mama," he said clearly. "I love you too, sweetheart," Clara whispered back. "Forever and always." The Duke put his arm around Clara's shoulders, and together, the 3 of them stepped out into the sunshine of a new beginning.